Now, one of the things that UK Column has been saying to our audience is it's becoming increasingly clear that it isn't national governments, it's not the UK government that's actually running the country. Our governments are simply the spokespeople for agenda coming in from the rules-based international order, of which the UN forms a key part. So, Diane, let's bring you in straight away with giving a bit of background to what this pernicious organisation is up to.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And hello, Ben. Happy to be here today. So I've been covering the past week the UN General Assembly, which officially concludes today, the 30th of September. For the past week, there has been a lot of action, as we saw last week, starting with the Summit of the Future, which led to the adoption of the Pact of the Future. And then we spent the last week in meetings in what was called the General Debate of the General Assembly of the UN. And there's been a lot of discussions from talks from the heads of state from around the world, the 193 member states, all participating and all having an equal vote in the General Assembly. And it's from the 79th session of the General Assembly, just so that we know, so that we're clear, the theme is leaving no one behind, acting together for the advancement of peace, sustainable development, and human dignity for present and future generations. So I spared everyone the video that they created from this past week. I've just got a couple of still images that I took out of their video. You can see the full thing on X if you would really like to. It first talked about the pact being the landmark new agreement, which will redefine global cooperation for generations. We had the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, saying our world is in a whirlwind, so talking about the change and acceleration that's happening. And we also had a special SDG moment with world leaders and special guests. So I'm sure that was a lovely time had by all. What I want to focus on is Sir Keir Starmer and his address to the General Assembly, which happened on Thursday last week. Let's hear what Keir had to say.
My message today is this. We are returning the UK to responsible global leadership because I think the international system can be better. We need it to be better. People talk about an age of polarization, impunity, instability, an unraveling of the UN Charter. And I fear that a sense of fatalism has taken hold. But our task is to say, no, we won't accept this slide into greater and greater conflict, instability, and injustice. Instead, we will do all we can to change it. This is the moment to reassert fundamental principles and our willingness to defend them, to recommit to the UN, to internationalism, to the rule of law. That's why the new Pact for the Future is so important. We must put new energy and creativity into conflict resolution and conflict prevention, reverse the trend towards ever greater violence, make the institutions of peace fit for purpose, and hold members to their commitments under the UN Charter. I can announce today that we're creating a new facility, the British International Investment, which will work with the City of London to mobilise billions in pension and insurance funds to invest in boosting development and fighting climate change. This is a great British innovation.
So we hear from that the plan is to take billions from people who didn't ask for this in the first place and channel it to wherever it is that they want to go with this. But what I want to point out in particular is to go back into the history, as I've been doing for the past few weeks, of where all this comes from at the UN. And we can go back again to the early 1970s. There's a book that is available through the UN Digital Library, which you can download for free, called In Defense of the Earth. And it contains 3 key documents from 1971, 1972, and 1974. 1971 was the first report that started talking about the relationship between development and environment and looking at issues of the environment related to what governments should be doing. And then the first conference that we had that talked about the issues of climate change and all these issues around what we need to do to save the planet, so to speak, was in Stockholm in 1972, which I will come back to in just a minute. We also had the 26 principles that were adopted at that conference about the relationship between the Earth and humans, and there were recommendations and an action plan. And then thirdly, in that book in 1974, we had the Kokiak Declaration, which resulted in further issues around saying that things weren't working. And they actually concluded in that report that more people are hungry, sick, shelterless, and illiterate today than when the United Nations was first set up. So does that mean the UN isn't actually really helping? So going back to the Stockholm Conference in 1972, this was a landmark conference. It was the first place where they started really talking about what they were going to do about the environment. So let's hear from Barbara Ward, who was a British economist who spoke at this conference. And what did Barbara have to say to us in 1972?
We have got to learn to live with stabilized populations, with a more modest use of resources, and we cannot cheat by simply saying we're going to carry on with the same division as we have now, because if 2/3 of humanity, as our delegates have been telling us again and again today, if 2/3 are to stay poor so that 1/3 can stay rich, my friends, they won't do it. It's as simple as that. Are we going to hear from our governments that they're going to sign the Environmental Declaration, that they're going to look after the oceans, that they're going to take a new look at the redistribution of world resources? Okay, it sounds splendid, but what guarantee have we that you don't mesmerize yourself by saying a thing is going to happen and then somehow kid yourself that it has happened? It hasn't happened, it will be very difficult, and it'll only happen in fact if there are enough citizens and enough people in this world who have this new vision and are prepared to stay with it, not only when they're young, but when they're infinitely decrepit. In other words, right through and right on. And to me, the great importance of Stockholm is the fantastic number of people who've come to this place under their own steam, under their own expense, because they want to participate in saving the planet that they love.
So we see a quite passionate woman there about these issues. She was one of the first to talk about the concept and the idea of sustainability in relation to the environment. Also in that video from that conference, there's a man called Professor Barry Commoner, who is from Washington University in the States, and he talked quite a bit about colonization. And from what I got from this is that he really believes that colonizing and the effect of colonization, we speak a lot about decolonization, or at least I do, talking about what decolonization means for the West, which is the destruction of our civilization, destruction of our culture. And I think essentially in the future, our resources and our money, if that's not, well, it's probably happening already. And so he had a paper that he wrote in 1975, which is called How Poverty Breeds Overpopulation and Not the Other Way Around. And ultimately what he said in this paper is that the West is responsible for the overpopulation problem due to us having a low death rate and a high standard of living. And he identified colonialism as a kind of democratic parasitism. So we are democratic parasites here in the West, according to Professor Commoner. He ended with the idea that if the root cause of the world population crisis is poverty, then to end it, we must abolish poverty. And if the cause of poverty is the grossly unequal distribution of the world's wealth, then to end poverty and with it the population crisis, we must distribute that wealth among nations and within them. So we directly see the Marxist language coming in right there. So this, along with the limits to growth from the Club of Rome, which I've covered, as well as Paul Raskin, where Paul Raskin mentioned in his book, Journey to Earthland, which I've cited previously, he referenced this 1972 conference. And what he said in that book was that the actions failed to match the rhetoric until the UN came up with their SDG agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, back in 2015, which we now see, of course, in Agenda 2021. In 1992, we had the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, which is where Agenda 21 was really started to work on there. That was kind of the foundational part of Agenda 21, and it was called the Earth Summit. So let's see what John Major, our prime minister at the time, had to say at that conference.
The world is our garden, and together we must cultivate it. This week at Rio, we have made a start. Beyond Rio, we must continue to carry it through. Mr. Chairman, for our generation and for future generations, there can be no other way. Thank you.
So at that Earth Summit, we see that the concept of sustainable development was an attainable goal for all of the people of the world, regardless of where they were at the local, national, regional, or international level. That had a result of 27 principles. The first one being human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. And so with the third principle was the right to development must be fulfilled so as to equitably meet, so there's the Marxist language again, developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. And what I want to say with this is that we see there's principles, we see these actions, we see these statements. And so then this leads us to this past week when we have the Pact for the Future, the Global Digital Compact, the Declaration on Future Generations, which is all the same language over and over again, where we're saying, well, we have these principles, we're going to save the planet, we're going to worship nature, we're going to worship man and the relationship between man and nature. And it all just eventually goes ahead to 2030 agenda on sustainable development. And so what I'm saying is I don't really see anything any different from what they were starting to do with us over 50 years ago. But what's next in this particular agenda, which was announced, was the climate plans, which are called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. And in 2025, this will be due. He told the world leaders that this requires aligning energy strategies with a 1.5 degree world, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and putting a price on carbon. So each party that signed up to the Paris Agreement is required to establish one of these and update it every 5 years. The UK does have one. Yeah, I will have the link to it in the show notes if you want to see what our national contributions are. So thanks for that. And later on in the show, I will talk a little bit more about some detailed points about the Pact for the Future and what this actually means for future generations, Brian.
Diane, thank you very much for that. And of course, we've got to keep reminding our audience that Keir Starmer has said his priority is with the UN, Davos, these other bodies. He simply regards national parliament as being a tribal area which can't really do anything. So this man is running the globalist of policies. But while these global policies are being fed to the population of UK, we are to